Hello, I'm Rubina Margosian, and this is the Week in Review. This week in the news, the mayor of Parakar and an off-duty police officer were killed. The suspect is in police custody. Armenia hosts NATO seminars. In attendance are Turkish and Azerbaijani delegations, and the government cuts back on the defense budget for 2026 but promises universal health care. Tune in to our weekly roundup of the news with me, Rubina Margosian. Parakar Mayor Valodia Grigorian and off-duty police officer Garen Abrahamian were killed this week, and a third man, Artsun Galestian, was wounded. The suspect of the shooting has been identified as Narek Ohanyan and is in police custody. The chief of criminal investigations has said the killing is of interpersonal nature and is linked to another case, the killing of the suspect's own brother back in February. The slain mayor's brother was a suspect in the February case. Grigorian, a representative of the opposition Country to Live in party, had been elected mayor this March, but before the identification and the apprehension of the suspect, the case was discussed in political overtones. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan condemned what he called a brazen armed attack, stressing that law enforcement must swiftly identify everyone involved. He added that a thorough analysis is needed to determine what preventative measures could have been taken to avert repeated outbreaks of violence and why they were not implemented. 3 days after the murders, the police chief of the Armavir region was dismissed in connection with the case. No further details were provided, and former President Serge Sargsyan's Republican Party blamed Pashinyan, saying most horrifying murders, repression of opposition voices, political persecutions including imprisonment, manipulation of justice, and the use of law enforcement for personal gain have become commonplace in Armenia. The party said that the murder of the opposition mayor in front of his own home is proof of the lack of protection for citizens, particularly those with opposition views, and a message meant to intimidate, silence, and eliminate everyone thinking outside the ruling system. The Republican Party of Armenia declared that it will not remain silent and retreat until Pashinyan's government is removed. In the meantime, the parliamentary opposition I Have Honor faction, which is essentially the Republican Party, has launched another attempt to impeach the prime minister. The opposition has tried to impeach Pashinyan before, but the two opposition factions in parliament remain 6 seats short of the vote needed to succeed. And on the sidelines of the World Atomic Week conference in Moscow, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan met with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to the Prime Minister's press office, Putin noted that Rosatom, the Russian company operating Armenia's nuclear power plant, generating roughly 30% of the country's electricity, is still working to extend the plant's operational lifespan. Pashinyan in turn noted that, in addition to the cooperation with Rosatom, Armenia is also currently in active dialogue with the Russian side and several other countries also in connection to building small modular reactors. In recent years, Armenia has said it's negotiating with a number of countries to build alternatives to the Metsamor nuclear power plant, and on August 8 this year, Armenia and the United States signed a memorandum of understanding on an energy security partnership, which includes provisions on civil nuclear cooperation, including small modular reactor technology. In Moscow, the two leaders also touched on broader bilateral ties. Putin highlighted that trade between Armenia and Russia reached a record $11.7 billion in 2024. Meanwhile, Pashinyan acknowledged that there has been a slight decline since, tied to global developments. He expressed confidence that trade could pick up momentum again. And Foreign Minister Arat Mirzoyan met with his Azerbaijani counterpart Ceyhun Bayramov on the sidelines of the 80th UN General Assembly in New York this week. Armenia's Foreign Ministry reported that the two discussed the possible next steps needed to advance the peace agenda, building on the August 8 Washington summit. And also this week, Armenia hosted the NATO Parliamentary Assembly's 108th Rose Roth Seminar, which is a series of seminars focused on regional and topical security issues and training programs. Delegations from Azerbaijan and Turkey also participated. Andani Kocharian, head of Armenia's delegation, said the seminar provides a crucial platform for dialogue and cooperation on the path to regional peace, and to that end, the participation of Azerbaijan and Turkey is significant. The Azerbaijani delegation is headed by Ramin Mamadov, former member of parliament in Azerbaijan and the official responsible for contacts with Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. Another participant, Murad Muradov, reiterated official Baku's rhetoric while in Yerevan, stating that Armenia's constitution contains potential territorial claims against Azerbaijan, a claim that creates the legal grounds for Azerbaijan to reconsider the peace agreement. And commenting on the Armenian territories occupied by Azerbaijan since 2021, he said that the first round of delimitation showed that it's not a one-way street. In some cases, lands previously controlled by Azerbaijan were transferred to Armenia, and in others, the reverse happened. The parties have agreed on the maps guiding the process, and he expressed confidence that they will continue to do so since the peace treaty clearly states that both sides fully recognize each other's territorial integrity. And while asked about references to Western Azerbaijan, Muradov said that it is a public organization representing people who once lived in Armenia and relates mainly to cultural heritage, not territorial claims. On Armenian hostages and detainees held in Azerbaijan, he stated that all POWs have been released and those still in custody in Baku have violated Azerbaijani law. And during her visit to Armenia, European Commissioner for Enlargement Marta Kos announced the second payment of 202 million euros under the Resilience and Growth Plan and the launch of a new high-level policy dialogue with Yerevan. The support will also cover key areas of Armenia-EU cooperation, including the EU visa liberalization process, which Kos noted that the Visa Liberalization Action Plan is in its finalization phase. She also met with Prime Minister Pashinyan to discuss the priorities of the Armenia-EU partnership, upcoming tasks and opportunities to deepen cooperation. They reviewed EU-supported programs in Armenia and ways to boost economic partnership. In a post on X, Kos later added that EU and Armenia have never been closer. Just a reminder, the EU adopted a 270 million euro Resilience and Growth Action Plan for Armenia for 2024-2027 following the April 5 Armenia-US-EU talks in Brussels last year. The first installment of 67.5 million euros from the plan was allocated in July of 2024. And also this week, the Constitutional Reforms Council adopted a decision to amend the controversial stable majority clause in Armenia's constitution. Daniel Ionisian, head of the Union of Informed Citizens NGO and a council member, explains that under the new draft, if no majority emerges, a second election will be held in which all parties will take part. Only if a majority still isn't formed will other mechanisms come into play. Well, currently, if elections don't produce a majority, a second round of election is held. In this round, only the two parties with the most votes compete, and the winner receives additional mandates to secure a parliamentary majority. This gives one party or coalition more seats than the votes they have received. The Council also approved procedures for the self-dissolution of the National Assembly, set the number of standing committees by law, and established a permanent ethics committee. They outlined how committees could issue no confidence conclusions against the deputy prime minister, minister, or diplomatic representative. And the Armenian government also approved the 2026 state budget, proposing a 15% cut to the military budget. Defense spending is set on $1.4 billion next year, down from the $1.7 billion in 2025. After the 2020 war, Armenia's defense budget grew steadily from around $797 million in 2021 to $1.7 billion in 2025. The 2026 budget is the first decrease since 2021, though it's still higher than at any point before 2024. Earlier, Prime Minister Pashinyan had explained that the 2025 rise in the defense spending included funds earmarked for debt obligations. This was to reduce the country's future debt burden. Loans that had to be paid around 2030 or 35 were managed last year. Finance Minister Vahe Hovhannisyan has outlined several other key priorities in the 2026 budget. In healthcare, a comprehensive health insurance system is set to be launched. For education, $13 million will be allocated to the Academic City program, covering design, construction, and international consulting services. Teacher and educational staff salaries will also increase based on certification results. Work on educational infrastructure will continue, including the construction, renovation, and equipment of schools and kindergartens. Road infrastructure is another focus. focus, with $172 million earmarked for the repair and maintenance of interstate, Republican, and regional roads. Finally, in water management, dam construction programs will continue, aiming to increase water resources and improve the efficiency of flow management. And in other news, Archbishop Mikhail Ajabayan has been found guilty of calling for the overthrow of the government. He was charged under the article on the seizure of power, which carries penalties ranging from a fine to up to 5 years in prison. Additional court hearings are scheduled for September 29, which will establish the final verdict. And as we said last week, September is full of a lot of anniversaries. On September 21, Armenia celebrated the 34th anniversary of its independence from the Soviet Union. To mark the event, the band of the armed forces marched in the Republic Square. In his Independence Day speech, Prime Minister Pashinyan said the dream of the 1991 referendum was never fully realized in the Third Republic, as blockades, war, economic decline, and immigration stood in the way. But with peace reached in August of this year, he said Armenia now has the chance to build the state people longed for. Pashinyan called this the start of the Fourth Republic, an independent, democratic, peaceful, and prosperous Armenia. And September 25 marked 2 years since the deadly fuel depot blast in Stepanakert. The explosion claimed 219 lives, left around 300 people injured, and 22 people are still missing. Armenia's law enforcement authorities are still investigating the incident. And that was all for this week. However, before we finish the podcast, a little bit about the articles we published this week. Today we published an article by Sandra Sadik. It's called Portrait of a Nation, Armenia. From bustling streets to remote border villages, Armenia reveals itself not only through history and hardship, but through the resilience and quiet courage of its people. Sandra captures a nation that remembers, rebuilds, and carries its past while daring to hope for the future. It's an interesting piece. She was a visiting journalist who stayed in Armenia for 2 months. In her piece, she also talks about her trips to Syunik and her trip to Yerebalur, and the realization of how much hardship the Armenian people are not speaking about. In another piece by staff writer Hovannes Nazaretian, Armenia's balancing act in a multipolar world, the author speaks about the global power shifts towards multipolarity. With Russia's retreat and ongoing regional pressure, Yerevan is pursuing a balanced and balancing foreign policy, deepening Western ties while engaging Iran, India, China, and others in a bold recalibration of its security and diplomacy. And just as a side note, we just recently opened a new section on EVN Report. It's called Environment, and this next article is the latest addition to that section. It's called From Urtazor to COP17, Biodiversity at Armenia's Crossroads. It's by Ani Bogosian, and she says as peace negotiations with Azerbaijan and regional integration projects advance, biodiversity corridors could become vital connectors across fractured landscapes and divided societies. With Armenia preparing to host COP17, the urgency of protecting its extraordinary biodiversity amid mounting ecological and political threats takes center stage. And we also published a piece that looks into judicial independence in Armenia and says it's more than just legal rules. It is a matter of culture, perception, and action. It's by Gor Sanvel, and the author broadens the debate, examining how law, ethics, and societal forces intersect, and calls for rigorous research to inform public understanding regarding the judicial system and judicial independence in Armenia. The piece is called Law, Power, and Perception, Broadening the Debate on Judicial Independence. And another piece by Armenia Tigranian, The Forced Displacement of Artsakh Armenians, Violated Rights and the Loss of Identity. Over 150,000 Armenians from Artsakh were forcibly displaced through war, blockade, and systemic persecution. Examined through international law, these events constitute forcible transfer, violating fundamental rights and undermining the principle of return. And basically, in other words, what she stresses in her piece, in her article, is that even if people of Artsakh chose to leave, that does not constitute a real choice. They were forced to leave. Therefore, their right to return should be respected. And last but not least, and on a lighter matter, we did publish a podcast this week with Bedo Demircian. It's about Armenian graphic novels, and it's called An Uncharted Territory because it is. Ria Comics is a recently established publication focusing on graphic storytelling, and with Bedo Demircian, who is a co-founder of the publication, we spoke about the readership, the concept of new kinds of storytelling, documentary graphic novels, and how Armenia kind of is maybe too late on the previous wave, but not too late on the new emerging wave of general interest in graphic novels. And that was all for this week, and thank you for joining us, and we'll be back with you again next week.